I told Michael when he asked me if I wanted to do this that I preferred being behind the lens rather than in front of it. So I was somewhat pleased that you're getting a disembodied voice, but hopefully pretty pictures.
We're getting both.
So this is National Capital Region. It's about 88,000 acres, as Michael has already said, in parts of Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, and all of the District of Columbia. And it includes some 35 park units. If you look in the lower left-hand corner, just right of where it says National Capital Region, you'll see a blow-up of the national park lands within the District of Columbia. When people think of the National Capital Region, this is usually what comes to mind. It's memorials and monuments. You see just barely at the beginning of the middle ground, the back of the World War II memorial, and then of course you cannot miss the Washington Monument. However, there's more to this region than that, and this is the stepping off point to my career in National Capital Region. Not long after I came here, I was introduced to the gentleman who was the Associate Regional Director for the office, which at that time was known as the Office of Public Affairs. And after I was introduced to him as the new Regional Archeologist, he looked at me and said, very much with a straight face, "Oh, everybody knows the only real archaeology in the National Park Service is out west." So this presentation will hopefully prove that individual more than a little wrong. We're going to start with Rock Creek Park.
Yeah.
It's almost 3,000 acres, just shy of 100 reservations, the biggest one being Rock Creek Park proper. And the reason I'm starting with this is because of this gentleman that you're going to be introduced to. Here you see the lands that represent Rock Creek Park. The biggest green area is Rock Creek Park proper. And it was the work done by William Henry Holmes of the Smithsonian Institution which put Rock Creek Park on the map. At the time that Holmes began his work in Rock Creek Park in the 1880s, there was a raging debate in American archaeology over very crudely worked artifacts, which Holmes argued were merely steps in the process of manufacturing stone tools, and another gentleman was arguing that no, these were eoliths or dawn stones of great antiquity comparable to those that were being found at the time in Europe. So Holmes undertook the first scientifically controlled, problem-oriented excavations in American archaeology. And here you see his map showing the Piney Branch quarries. And the main part of the quarry is in the upper left-hand corner of the map. There you will see a V-shaped inverted V that represents what Holmes called the rivulet. And then you'll see the excavations or trenches which he and his workmen dug into the side of the valley walls. These quarries are quartzite, and here's one of Holmes' cross-sectional profiles showing the quarry face on the right, the incredible talus slope, which is made up of lithic debris from the working of the stones once the cobbles of quartzite were mined. And then you can actually see what Holmes referred to as a great shot deposit, which is in front of one of the still intact deposits of the quartzite boulders that you see on the far right. This is the actual sequence, starting with a cobble. Holmes referred to this as test flakes that were removed so you could see the inside of the stone to determine whether it was something that the knapper wanted to continue to work. If they did, they then proceeded from left to right. Item B is one of Holmes's so-called turtlebacks, so-called because it has a faceted face on one side, and then you have the unworked or cortex on the underside, or the reverse of the object. And they continue all the way down until you get to F, which is a quarry blade. So at that point, you're just nothing more than a few minutes away from a final tool form, whatever you wanted that tool to be. If you walk the area today, you can find this stuff hand over fist. So here are quartzite flakes from the reduction of the cobbles into quarry blades. Here you see one where they had begun doing that, and this is something that Charles Abbott, who was on the other side of the debate from Holmes, he was the one that was arguing that these were eoliths or dawnstone of great antiquity. Well, this is the kind of thing that Charles Abbott was saying, yeah, this is a hand axe, it's a dawnstone. Not, and here you see another larger boulder of quartzite with some of the flakes removed. These probably were used, I would imagine, because it's a good quality quartzite to make finished stone tools, and a hammerstone. And this stuff is still visible if you walk the quarry today in Rock Creek Park. It's in there by the tons, literally. This was a photograph that Holmes took. His work in the Piney Branch quarries was recognized at the time as a great advance in science. So much so that he was asked to do an exhibit at the Columbian Exposition of 1892. To help bring that exposition in his exhibit to life, he had these life-size figures made, and these are three of several others that are not in this picture. And he actually took all this out to the quarry. What you see in the far right figure is the face of some of Holmes's excavations. So you have intact archaeological deposits between the Indian on the far right and the one in the middle ground. They apparently took a canvas and put it over part of the excavation behind where the Indian on the far right is, covered it with dirt. But he wanted to make it look as though these people really were mining the deposits there at Rock Creek Park. In front of the Indian on the far left who's seated flint napping, you'll see actual artifacts that were collected by Holmes during his excavations. And to really add to the whole scene, you'll even see a full grooved axe that's been rehafted lying on the ground just to the left of the Indian on the far left. So he went all out. Well, he had a full-size diorama that they set up at the Columbian Exposition, and these figures were some of those that were part of that exhibit. I thought it was pretty clever of Holmes to do this, and you can actually see what the quarry likes. So the rivulet is off to the far left, and you can see that the area was heavily wooded even at the time that Holmes was working there in the late 1880s and early 1890s. The Great Falls of the Potomac was the one spot that had to be portaged if you were moving up and down the Potomac River. And at the Great Falls, you find a number of things, including petroglyphs. And here is one example. If you start at the top, you'll see there's a Y or a split. This is apparently representing some prehistoric Pablo Picasso's rendering of an anadromous fish, which has a split tail. So if you follow then the Y coming down, you'll see you have a wide line that then leads to a body that's been accentuated. The innermost body of the fish is a diamond, and you'll see two cupules representing the eyes, and then beneath the two eyes, a cupule representing the mouth. And then that innermost diamond has been accentuated by a series of three additional diamonds emphasizing the body of the fish. This is almost spot on with a series of similar petroglyphs that were found at a place on the Susquehanna River north of Baltimore called Bald Friar. And these were documented in the late 19th, early 20th century before the Conowingo Dam flooded the area. Some of those petroglyphs were able you'll see a whitewater V off to the left of the center of the screen, and that represents the basal stones of a prehistoric stone fish weir. The archaeological site that is outlined in red and labeled 18 AG, and you don't need to know the rest of the number, that means Allegheny County in the state of Maryland, is the site of the largest rock hearth platform I have ever seen. It's over 30 feet across, and it's buried 2 feet below existing grade because of various floods that have occurred since the rock hearth platform, which apparently was built to process the fish and to smoke them. And this is the first time I'm aware of here in the Middle Atlantic of a processing site being one of these stone fish weirs. Anyway, it was pretty exciting when we discovered this while doing GIS in this upper portion of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. So at this point you are near Old Town, Maryland, which means that you are in the heart of the Alleghenies. Another site on the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal of great significance is this particular one, which is the oldest and most deeply stratified prehistoric site that we are currently aware of in the National Capital Region. It's 8 feet down to the early Archaic level, and it says it spans 11,000 years. So you have a late woodland dating to about 1500 AD, an early woodland component dating to around 1000 AD, a late or middle Archaic component dating to around 3800 BC, and then an early Archaic component at about 8000. It's a pretty amazing site, and it preserves wood, seeds, pollen, animal bone is preserved, and there are features. So this is a very important site for this region. Another site of great interest that we came across in the years that I was working here was here at Fletcher's Boathouse, also within the C&O Canal National Historical Park. And this was part of a compliance Section 106 project. And they were going to put a cantilevered pedestrian and bicycle bridge over the C&O Canal so that people could get down to Fletcher's Boathouse. It was going to have a sizable footprint, and in doing the archaeology for that, we discovered all of these amazing underground storage silos. They were literally cylinders, 4 to 5 feet across and just as deep, and they you can see a whole series of them here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that's under excavation, and this is what they look like before you start excavation. You can actually see the circular outline of the soil stain. This particular one is just a little over 4 feet across, and it was a little deeper than 4 feet, and they are almost perfect cylinders. Unfortunately, we don't know what they were storing in them, since they obviously removed the content, and then having removed the contents, they used them as handy trash receptacles for the duration of their stay. So they had dug through earlier stratified deposits. So we had everything in here from early Archaic projectile points dating back to around 8000 BC all the way up. But the lion's share of the material culture that we found here suggests that these were dug probably in the Middle Woodland period, somewhere around 2 to 500 or 600 AD. And it was amazing. We had never seen anything like these features, not only in the Potomac Valley, but we hadn't seen anything like these in the entire Chesapeake region at that time. Another surprise, in doing urban archaeology in the nation's capital, we find these pockets of preservation. So if you look at all the roads that are around here, you would say, my God, what a spaghetti bowl. Nothing survived of any consequence in this mess. Wrong. So you have three sites. The Peter House site, which, as the name suggests, preserves a historic period house site dating from the late 18th and early 19th century, but it also masked some earlier prehistoric deposits. Then you have Ramp 3 in Whitehurst West, and I'm going to show you those. Ramp 3 is the, with a capital T-H-E, most significant prehistoric discovery in the city of Washington ever. Here you can see us coming down on it. To let you know that doing urban archaeology can have all sorts of dangers, if you'll see the person that's on the far left where you can just barely see their right elbow, well, if you went another 3 feet, you would come to a vertical excavation that would rise up, and then 2 feet over from the edge of that excavation were concrete Jersey barriers, and on the other side of the concrete Jersey barrier was the Rock Creek and Potomac Parkway. So heaven forbid if any of those Jersey barriers had been knocked off to one side because it would have crushed an archaeologist. Well, that little pile of stones that you see slightly off from center of that marks a large pile of stones, the heaviest of which weighed upward of around 40 pounds, that covered this. Here you see the drawing of part of the feature. It was a ritual cremation pit, and all sorts of things were found in it. The remains of probably a woman between 35 and 40 years of age when she died and then was cremated. Bird bone from a big bird. It was more than likely a golden eagle, since it was a raptor. We obviously don't have condors back here. This ain't California. So it either had to be an American bald eagle or a golden eagle. There was no way to know which, but anyway, a raptor had been cremated with the person, and there were also shark's teeth. They were disc, fabric, yes, you heard me correct, a hammer to stone, and all sorts of other things. And here's an example of some of the objects that were found in this ritual cremation pit. The antler head bone comb or headdress is almost identical to one that was found by one of William Henry Holmes's associates in a mound in the northern Shenandoah Valley, almost exactly 100 miles to the west. If you look over the far upper right, the chert knife blade, the source for that chert is 100 miles to the west in the northern Shenandoah Valley. You can also see stone gorgets, a wooden bead, the only one ever recovered to this point in the Potomac Valley, a stone phallus, and then shark's teeth that were part of a necklace or teeth that were sewn on a garment. It's hard to know whether they, but they were perforated. You can see in the top row, second from the left of the top row of the shark's teeth, there's one of the holes where the roots of the shark's teeth had been perforated for either suspension or for sewing on a garment. This site is unheard of, and it dates around 600 to 800 AD. Just on the other side of the Rock Creek and Potomac Parkway at the Whitehurst West site, 15 feet below existing grade, we came across this. And what you're looking at is a layer of fire-cracked rock, lithic debris, and in this we found over a dozen transversely broken triangular blades. They were processing fish here too. And so the fire-cracked rock, the transversely broken triangular blades, and they were probably preparing the fish and then smoking them here. And this is 15 feet down. Because it was 15 feet down, we had to build the most amazing walls to meet OSHA standards so that we could open up this relatively small area. So you can well imagine the size of the excavation given the fact that we had to step it down to open up this area. By the way, when the archaeological firm that was excavating this site was on site doing the excavations, this was during the presidency of Bill Clinton. And there was a hiker-biker path right beside here. And guess who came jogging by one day in the early part of his first term as president, but President Clinton. So everybody else is way down in the ground underneath a cover that we had to construct over this. It was sort of a Quonset hut-like plastic cover because we were doing these excavations in the dead of winter, late December, January, February. So the only two archaeologists who were outside were the two young ladies who were screening the dirt. And so there is a very well-known photograph of those two ladies standing to either side of President Clinton. So you never know who's going to drop in on an archaeological excavation in National Capital Region. Downriver from the city, about 12, 15 miles, directly across from George Washington's Mount Vernon is Piscataway Park. And here you see Piscataway Creek and its confluence with the Potomac River. This place is one giant archaeological site. You cannot turn a shovelful of dirt over in Piscataway Park and not see some sort of artifact, whether of prehistoric or historic origin. This is one of John White's famous from-life watercolor drawings of Algonquian Indians in what is now northeastern North Carolina, but their culture was very similar to those of the Algonquian-speaking peoples in Tidewater, Virginia, the Eastern Shore, and the Potomac Valley below the falls. So if you notice, you have an entrance to the village where they do the overlapping stockade walls, and here you can see something similar in the ground. So there are your post stains, and there's where they overlapped. And this village in particular had a rather narrow opening on this side of it. It was a single occupation, and apparently not one that was long-term. If you go farther to the west, in the mountains of western Maryland, at Catoctin Mountain Park, it is the national park that surrounds the presidential retreat of Camp David. And we did a 4-year archaeological survey of Catoctin Mountain Park, and this is one of the quarries, in this case rhyolite, that we found. So much different material to work than the quartzite quarry of Piney Branch in the heart of Washington, D.C. in Rock Creek Park. And this is one of the large boulders that's exposed that's had a number of large fragments of rhyolite knocked off from it to make stone tools. And here you can see some of the lithic debris from the various stages of working the rhyolite there in the quarry. This is an example of the very worn and heavily patinated and used bifaces that we find there in Catoctin Mountain Park. These are late Archaic up to Middle Woodland, and they have literally been used to a nub and then have been exposed on the surface for quite some time to receive this sort of patination. In the 18th century, there's more to what you see above ground than meets the eye. So you've got this really nice mid-18th century manor house called Harmony Hall, located in Maryland, just downriver and not far from George Washington's Mount Vernon on Broad Creek. Well, they were going to upgrade the house so that it could be rented out, and they had to do some new service lines into the structure. So we did archaeology, and it's a good thing we did, because we found a 1695 to 1715 earth-faster post-in-the-ground house. And here you see the excavations. This particular case, I'll go back one. That photograph was taken, if you look at the covered central hall entrance on the landward side of the manor house, that photograph was taken from the window that is the second from the far left corner of the main block of the house. And so I'm looking straight down on the excavations. And this structure burned, and that's why you have the dark stain. Here is one of the post holes and post moles from the earth-fast house, and you see the illustration on the left that shows a typical earth-fast house. This one did have a cellar hole underneath it. And this is some of the excavations inside the burned area of the house. You have a wrought iron strap hinge from a door in the immediate foreground, and then broken fragments from a wine bottle in the middle ground. This is me back when I had hair on my head and my face. This was a while ago. And here you can see the stratigraphy of the burn layer of the house. And then all the material that built up above that, post-1715, represents changes in the cultural landscape after the brick manor house of circa 1750-ish was constructed. So it was pretty amazing, the buildup of material just from the landscaping activities that took place over time after 1715 to when the property came into the National Park Service in the 1980s. Another thing that is of interest, we have a number of canals here. Of course, I've already spoken of the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Historical Park. Well, at Great Falls Park, Virginia, we have one of the earliest canals, the earliest one here in this area, the Potomac Canal. Its idea began in 1785 and was the brainchild of George Washington, and also he enlisted the aid of Light Horse Harry Lee, the Revolutionary War general, and a dear friend of George Washington's. So this is Lock 1. There are 5 locks, and this was an engineering marvel of the time because these 5 locks provided over 80 feet of lift in less than a mile. People actually came from Europe to see this because it was considered such an engineering feat for its day, and it began operation around 1803. It took 17 years to build from its blue sky conception until it became a functioning reality. Unfortunately, the Potomac Canal had a relatively short life. It actually consisted of 5 skirting canals, and then the rest of the distance it used the natural basin of the Potomac River. Unfortunately, we tend to have severe droughts around here, so that the Potomac Canal really couldn't operate year-round. It actually was lucky if it could operate half a year. And so it ceased operation, and the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal then took its place, as it were, and they dug that from Tide Lock in Georgetown to end of terminus in Cumberland, Maryland, 184.5 miles. This is looking down in the excavations, which revealed what is still the oldest remnants of the miter sill and the bottoms of the 2 original lock gates to Lock 1 Potomac Canal. And they are the oldest lock gates thus far found in North America. On the other side of the Potomac, at Great Falls, Maryland, on the C&O Canal, there is another petroglyph, but this one from historic times. If you look in the photograph in the upper left-hand corner, just to the right of the person on the right, just to the right of their shoulder, that you can see is the figure that you see the blow-up of in the lower right. And these are very similar to anyone who's knowledgeable or knows of the famous face jugs made in stoneware in the South. And in the 1920s, there was an African-American CCC camp at Great Falls, Maryland. So this quite possibly was the work of one of those men who was part of the CCC camp there in the 1920s. Moving upriver to Harpers Ferry National Historical Park in West Virginia, The building the smith and forging shop is something that you couldn't miss, just like you couldn't miss the famous engine house or John Brown's fort, which is shown at the mouth of the street on the left side. That's a macadamized street, by the way, and this is the only known photograph of the Harpers Ferry Armory taken before the Civil War and before it was destroyed as a result of the war. That smokestack, by the way, is 90 feet high. And these are the amazing excavations that were overseen by Mia Parsons with the assistance of Darlene Hassler, who's now a permanent archaeologist at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park, and also Justin Ebersol, who's now, I'm happy to say, a permanent archaeologist and architect at the C&O Canal National Historical Park. And here you can see their amazing excavations. The stratigraphy is outrageous. So if we go to the bottom of the excavation, you're in late Archaic times. And all the debris from the fly ash, which are those two layers that are kind of a whitish gray, well, that bottommost layer of white ash is sitting on top of a landform, and beneath it are a number of prehistoric occupations, the early of which is probably late Archaic, and there may also be a middle woodland component here as well. So the industrial activities of the armory in the earliest part of the armory grounds, which is here, indeed preserved some amazing historic and prehistoric components. Moving to Manassas National Battlefield Park, the park wanted to know which of three images, including this, the only photograph, was the real Portici. There were two other from-life sketches done by Civil War artist correspondents that had been labeled Portici also. So we had three images, this photograph and the two from-life sketches by Civil War correspondents, all purporting to be the real Portici. So the park wanted to know what it looked like and if we could determine which of the three images was Portici. Well, we were able to. It was quite simple, actually. And Portici is indeed what is shown in this photograph. Those massive double-end parapeted brick chimneys are incredible. And then just in front of the one that you see that's facing us, which would be the west elevation of the house, the front elevation is facing south. That structure just in front of that massive double-end parapeted chimney is the kitchen, and the kitchen had a whistle walk attached to it. And we, at this time, were in the Camelot or glory days of the Regional Archeology program. Myself and three others were full-time permanent archaeologists here. That's the greatest number we've ever had at one time here in National Capital Region. And we had an active volunteer list of over 120 people. And here are some of those dedicated individuals helping with the excavations. Well, this is what we found. So there is the footprint of Portici in the upper left, and it had a full English cellar. And you can see there was a bulkhead entrance to the cellar on the right or eastern side of the structure. It was almost a perfect square, not quite. The front elevation facing south would be down. You can even see that they dug a little trench for drainage to take water away from the house and go under the porch. And you know it's under the porch because you can see the stones that were set for the wooden pier to hold up the porch, and there are three of the stones still left in place. The footprint of the detached kitchen with that massive chimney at the end of it is just to the left of the footprint of the house. And the fire that took it out started on the left, and we even had a fire marshal come out and look at our excavations once we were complete, and it was obvious even to us where the fire had begun. It was apparently ignited probably by a spark that was still in the fireplace or hearth on the main floor of the house on the left side. And from there, it ignited the rest of the house. The family had left the home once the Battle of First Manassas, which raged all around this place, had taken place. So they were living with relatives elsewhere. And Union soldiers occupied this house sometime in late winter, early spring, probably around March of 1862. And we think that they may have had a fire going and then had not checked to make sure that all the embers were out, and that an ember popped out and ultimately caused the fire that caused the destruction of the house. So much was found here, and the state of preservation was superb because a lot of the metal had been re-annealed because it had been through a second fire after having been forged. Here you have a heating stove insert from the second floor of the house. And this house collapsed in on itself literally like a house of cards. So it all fell into the full English cellar, which entombed the remains. First floor, second floor, when the floor joists burned out of the wall pockets and the second floor collapsed, the heating stove inserts pulled out of the chimneys. This one did a somersault, landed on its back, and there you see the conserved door that was part of it. It split along the construction of the cast iron heating stove insert. It was made in Boston, 1823. Pretty amazing. Beneath that, we found this. So you see on the far right the cabriole leg to a piece of fine furniture. And on the left in this excavation, there is a chestnut plank from the first floor of the house. And then you can see how they constructed it. They actually excavated the cellar out of the living rock, which in this case is a Triassic red sandstone. And then they used a technique just like they did for the locks in the C&O Canal and Potomac Canal. They took clay and they puddled the floor so that you would have a even flat floor. You can see what it was like because the Triassic sandstone had been turned on its side, and if you had left that as the floor, you could have been stone cold sober and you would have still had a hard time walking across that floor. So they then put in this 2/10 to 3/10 of a foot red clay floor, and that was the floor of the full English cellar. The reason those bricks are up there, they are the apron to a small fireplace or hearth. They punched into the flue of one of those two chimneys on the east elevation, and this is inside the full English cellar on the east elevation of the house, and they constructed a small room. And we know this because we found walls that were just 2 bricks thick that butted up against the original interior construction of the cellar. And we think that this was a room that was constructed as a sleeping place for one of the slaves to Portici. Another fascinating thing, at the corner that you see there of the fireplace apron, we found a whole little series of over a dozen tin-wash straight pins. So someone had been doing their sewing by the light of the hearth. And we also found eggshell where they would make their meals on the hearth here as well. Some of the objects that came out of this are pretty amazing. The only known African heirloom artifact that we've found anywhere in any of the region's parks, and it's the woman's finger ring that you see on the slightly to the right of the center of the slide. It's carved from ebony, and ebony wood only grows in Africa and Asia. It's the size of the ring that suggests to us that this was a woman's finger ring, and so it is a genuine African heirloom artifact that came over on the hand of a woman who had survived the dread Middle Passage to come to Virginia. To the right of it is a rim shirt of colonial wear, but this we know was certainly used by African Americans and most likely was also made by them. And almost all of it is a vessel form that is a shallow, wide mouth bowl, the kind of thing that would have served as something for someone who is making a gumbo or some such dish, because these small, shallow, wide mouth bowls are a form that would not have been available commercially from any of the many local potteries in the Shenandoah Valley or not far from here in Alexandria, Virginia. So we think that these bowl forms are being made by the enslaved laborers because they were being used to serve the dishes that they were making. And in the bottom, below the ring and the rim sherd, you see 3 gaming pieces, probably used in the African-derived game of mancala. And then we also have almost always the requisite blue bead in the upper right corner just above the rim sherd. And blue was a color that, given where these slaves probably were coming from in Africa, was a color that was believed to ward off a bad or evil spirit. At Bronner Farm, also within Manassas National Battlefield Park, we had an interesting project. There was a great discussion among historians and architects as to whether that clapboard wooden structure you see in a state of disrepair in the middle slide was standing at the time of the battle. The Battle of Bronner Farm fought August 28, 1862. And the answer to that question is a resounding no. It was not standing. And it was archaeology that proved it, both for the historians and the historical architects. If you look at that middle photograph, you'll see that line of stones there in front of the standing structure. I should say the barely standing structure. And that is the original foundation to the house that indeed was standing at the time of the Battle of Bronner Farm in August 1862. If you look at the map in the lower right of the slide, you will see the 2 exterior chimneys that were on the east elevation of the original structure. And they actually used the footprint of one of those as the exterior chimney for the post-Civil War house that was moved on site. And then if you look on the far left, you'll see a thin line representing a linear arrangement of stones that was the foundation for the west elevation of the original structure, probably built about 1810, 1820, or in this case, for the original house. And then after the battle, another home from probably less than a mile away was moved to the site and served as the extant structure, running on an east-west axis and incorporating some of the stones from the west elevation of the first house, and they plopped them over and put them between the remnants of the foundation wall on the far left or west side and filled them in adjacent to it so that you had another exterior fireplace or hearth on the west elevation, just like the one that they repurposed on the east elevation. The huge L addition was added on in 1904-05. And so this whole thing was modernized and Victorianized in 1904-05. But that structure still has the remnants of the earlier house that was moved from somewhere else after the first house was pretty much heavily perforated by heavy small arms fire during the Battle of Bronner Farm. All sorts of battle-related material. Here you see Michael Strutt, who's now an archaeologist in the state of Texas, and there you see the large stones of the foundation of the original house that were on the west elevation. And immediately in front of Michael, just to the right of his right hand with the paintbrush in it, was this U.S. Model 1816 bayonet. That would have been mounted on the end of a U.S. Model 1816 musket, probably one made at Harper's Ferry Armory. And at this point in the war, 1862, only Virginians and other southern units would have been using antiquated firearms like that. This definitely was not carried by the 19th Indiana, who were armed with the latest state-of-the-art 1858, probably, we don't know what model, but most likely a Springfield and 58 caliber we know for sure because of these things. So we knew that the 19th Indiana Regiment, part of the Black Hat Brigade, soon to be renamed the Iron Brigade. So the Iron Brigade went up against the South's most famous brigade in the Army of the Potomac, Army of Northern Virginia, the Stonewall Brigade. So you had the Black Hat Brigade, soon to become the Iron Brigade, standing 60 to 70 yards away from the firing line of the Stonewall Brigade. And these two regiments, along with the 19th Indiana and some other Confederate regiments, blasted away at one another for 45 minutes to an hour and a half in the dwindling sunlight, and neither one budged. And here you see the unfired or dropped 58 caliber bullets during battle. And here you see in the upper left-hand corner a period illustration of a firing line. So you have two ranks, and the action on the firing line is a very frenzied thing. So your butterfingers, you're nervous, you drop a cartridge, it doesn't get loaded, and so you have a dropped or unfired round. Or you're in the act of reloading, and you're hit while getting ready to load the cartridge into the muzzle of your most likely rifle musket. And we know it had to have been a rifle musket because we found all those unfired 58 caliber bullets. You also find other stuff like we did here. You've got an iron roller buckle from beneath a Union cartridge box. Just above the scale, you have the iron stopper to a canteen. Just to the right of it is a knapsack hook. To the right of that is the metal bottom to a leather bayonet scabbard. So bits and pieces of uniform, of accoutrements, as well as unfired bullets mark a firing line. And the drop bullets are shown in the map in yellow, and the militaria, all those bits and pieces off of accoutrements and equipage and uniforms. And look at that. You've got a perfectly straight line. What's interesting is you see the drop bullets that are just below the firing line. Well, that's the area where the 19th Indiana advanced and then retreated when the firing stopped. And we did survey work in advance of that line, and we found nothing except for shrapnel from Confederate artillery. We found no drop bullets. We found no militaria off of Union accoutrements and uniforms. So that indeed represents the northernmost firing line of the 19th Indiana. And this, I was told before we began this project by Park Service people, by Civil War collectors, that, quote, the area was hunted out and we wouldn't find a thing. Well, the more fool them. Metal detectorists, especially at this time, this is in the 1980s, walk a random pattern as usual. And then when they get hits, it's like a feeding frenzy. And so they focus where they're getting hits. So it's not systematic, and things can still be preserved. And in this case, a segment of what we know for sure is the firing line of the 19th Indiana. So we don't have to guess where they were. We know for a fact the farthest northern advance of the 19th Indiana. One other thing that was a surprise, after the Civil War, John Bronner had his daughter, who was illiterate, fill out a claim to the United States government for damages suffered from Union soldiers prior to and as a result of the Battle of Bronner Farm. Well, he didn't get his reparations that he was hoping for, but in the claims that you filed, you had to list in detail what you had lost. And he lost 1 horse, 1 cow, and 22 pigs. And in this small roasting pit, we found the bones of 1 cow, a pig, and a horse. And as if icing on the cake, sort of the maraschino cherry maybe on top of the icing, we found a Confederate drum-style canteen, which you can see the little white arrow there on the left in the lower part, center of the slide, is pointing to it, and you can see the pewter spout. And it had been crushed, so it was tossed away, and it was the last thing that was tossed on top of the remnants of this small roasting pit. Undoubtedly, these were famished Confederates indeed, because the part of the horse that they were gnawing on here was from the lower leg, a lower hind leg at that. So that was old school. Now I'm going to bring you up to the 21st century and battlefield archaeology, new school with GIS. So we are now at Antietam National Battlefield, the bloodiest day in all of U.S. military history. Over 23,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or missing in action during 12 hours of dawn to dusk combat. And what we're going to focus on is that little rectangle of yellow inside the boundary of the Piper farm. The Sunken Road or Bloody Lane is named because supposedly the lane ran with blood because of so many of the Confederates that were killed in it during the fighting in the late morning action as part of the Battle of Antietam. Here is Alexander Gardner photograph showing 4 dead Confederates. That is the white picket fence that surrounded the 16-acre commercial apple orchard. It was the only commercial orchard anywhere within a country mile of Sharpsburg, Maryland, and it was part of Henry Piper's farm. And if you notice, look at the Confederate on the far right in the foreground. He's got 2 of the pickets from that fence underneath him. They actually picked that body up and moved him into the picture to compose it so there would be more dead Rebs and more gore. Alexander Gardner perfected this little technique of horror, if you will. He did it unashamedly at Gettysburg multiple times. So you always have to be careful when you're looking at these Civil War images to look for signs that perhaps they were composed, as Mr. Gardner certainly did here. So we had this 16-acre orchard, and the reason we were called in to do archaeology is because the Park Service wanted to restore it. It was an apple orchard, and so they were going to be planting apple trees at 30-foot intervals, and they were putting in 2 to 3 caliper trees, which means you were going to have a 2 to 3 foot root ball. And this in a part of the battlefield that, to the best of our knowledge, had never, I repeat, never been metal detected. Why? Because everyone wanted to go to the Bloody Lane, to the cornfield, which opened the battle in the early morning hours of September 17th, or the end of the battle at Burnside Bridge. So that's where the historians and the collectors all focused their attention. To them, they didn't think much, if anything at all, happened in the orchard. Wrong. So we go in, and our contract archaeologists at this time in 1997, they were URS Corporation archaeologists and volunteers, did a 20% sample because the work of the URS archaeologists demonstrated, and they had done several years of work at the battlefield by the time the work at the orchard was undertaken, that a 20% sample of transects will allow one to define troop positions or troop movements on a Civil War battlefield. So they did a 20% sample. Here you see them metal detecting in one of the 2-meter wide corridors that they had marked out. The upper right slide, you see targets that have been discriminated by the metal detecting. And then in the lower right, you see, in this case, a 3-ring 58 caliber mini ball that had been retrieved from the hole that was dug. So that was the process. And then we updated it. So in 2002, 2004, and 2007, archaeologists from the Regional Archeology program, with the assistance of park staff and volunteers, undertook the work, because planting these trees is very labor intensive, and apple trees are not cheap. So the park had to do the replanting of the historic orchard in phases. Total of 4, which is why we had 4 archaeological field seasons to coincide just before they began the planting. And here you see in the upper left corner the archaeologists of the Regional Archeology program and our volunteers, and you can see some of the red flags that indicate the location of potential military targets, or metal targets more precisely. And then in the upper right, we finally graduated from a TopCon transit to a total station. So we piece plotted everything in, URS using a TopCon transit, and we of the Regional Archeology program using a total station. In the lower left, you see some of the artifacts that have been retrieved, the military artifacts with field specimen numbers. You see in the center there, again, a .58 caliber 3-ring bullet as it was about to come out of the ground. And then our lab at the Museum Resource Center in Landover, Maryland, where the objects were processed and cataloged. And this is what we came up with. We found over 2,000 military artifacts, and all the black dots are the military artifacts. Any of the ones that are open circle, those are non-military artifacts. And that was a 25% sample, because with the additional work we did, we added another 5% to the 20%, so we have a 25% sample, which means that theoretically there should be at least another, 6,000 military artifacts out there. So this area clearly was never metal detected. A rarity indeed on any Civil War battlefield in the Eastern Theater of the American Civil War. We're going to start with the attack of the 7th Maine. There were 5 events that we were able to discriminate based on the archaeology in the orchard, 5 separate military actions within the footprint of the orchard, and the one I'm going to talk about is the last one that took place late in the afternoon, around 5 o'clock to 5:30 p.m. on September 17, 1862. And we're starting with this image because it shows a Confederate 12-pounder smoothbore artillery piece. Well, this is what was being used by the 2-gun section under the command of Captain Boyce of the South Carolina Artillery. So if you look at the map, the very bottom, just above the Park Service arrowhead, you'll see the gun position of Boyce. And he had 2 of these 12-pounders. We know they were smoothbores because they were shooting that ugly stuff in the red outlined rectangle. That's 1-inch iron canister. It is very poorly cast, which screams Confederate made. And those nasty things were packed into something the equivalent of a high-C juice can and then fired basically at point-blank range at infantry. In this particular case, the 7th Maine, who had been told to attack Confederate positions at the Piper Farm. And so you will see the Confederate forces of R.H. Anderson, which are aligned along the Hagerstown Turnpike on the far left, and then just cattywampus from that position, G.T. Anderson's Confederates, remnants of many Confederate units that had been basically almost wiped out when the Confederate position in the Sunken Road or Bloody Lane collapsed as a result of pressure from the attacking Union forces. And so there along the Piper Lane, you see a cluster of structures representing the Piper House, and then that large rectangle just up from one of the Confederate regiments represented by the linear red line is the Piper Barn. So the 7th Maine was ordered by Colonel Irwin, who is reputed to have been inebriated at the time, to attack Confederate positions and to drive them away from the Piper farm. Well, he was being asked to do this with just over 180 odd men. An entire division had failed to do that earlier in the day, which strongly supports people's contention that indeed Colonel Irwin was 3 sheets in the wind or drunk as a skunk. So here you see the distribution of the 1-inch iron canister coming from Boyce's 2 guns. He probably only fired those 2 pieces once each because these things were the equivalent of a combat shotgun. By the time the 7th Maine got into the orchard to try and fight their way back to Union lines, which are in the upper part of the slide, represented by the units in primarily gray and blue. So Brooks, Marr, Owen, those are Union units, and that's where you can see the area up there marked 7th Maine. Well, that's where they began their attack. So they had to come, march in front of the Union units, then come south into this little valley, going against R.H. Anderson and G.T. Anderson. And, of course, with only 180-odd men, they didn't get very far before they had to skedaddle. So that's what Boyce was trying to do. Well, so were a lot of other folks. So here you see the archaeological footprint, literally, of the retreat of the 7th Maine, occurring between 5 and 5:30 in the afternoon on September 17, 1862. So they swung into the orchard. Now, luckily, these gentlemen were carrying the U.S. Model 1841 rifle, also known as the Mississippi rifle because it had been made famous by a regiment of Mississippians, interestingly enough, commanded by Jefferson Davis during the Mexican War. And these things mounted a huge saber bayonet. So because they had the saber bayonet mounted on these full rifles, these are not rifle muskets with only 3 or 4 lands and grooves. These are 7 lands and grooves. They are a totally rifled interior bore. So they used those saber bayonets on the end of their U.S. Model 1841 rifles to cut through that incredible picket fence. And they swung up, and what you see here, the circle with the dot in the middle represents the unfired or dropped 54 caliber mini balls used by the 7th Maine. Because that U.S. Model 1841 rifle I was speaking of, well, guess what? It's 54 caliber. And so where you see the drops, they define a firing line where someone had to stop and physically reload because these are muzzle loaders. They're rifles. And so you'll see one line, and then you'll see a second one somewhat above it. Now, where you see the clusters of those dropped bullets, notice you see all these red outlined triangles. Those are fired Confederate rounds. So you're looking from left to right, a 54 caliber Gardner, a 58 caliber Gardner, a .577 caliber Enfield, and a .54 Raleigh pattern bullet. All these are made in Confederate laboratories. So we know for a fact that these were being fired by Confederates. And it's amazing. We did a kernel analysis, and there is an insanely high degree of association statistically between the dropped 54 caliber carried by the 7th Maine and the fired Confederate mini balls being shot at them by their foes. Now we'll do the flip side. So here we have, at the top in the red outlined photograph, fired 44 caliber pistol bullets and fired .54 caliber mini balls with 7 lands and grooves, meaning then they could only have been fired by people using the U.S. Model 1841 rifle. And it's amazing. And then below that are the unfired or dropped Confederate rounds. And again, left to right, an unfired 54, then 58 caliber Gardners, an unfired Enfield, complete with the wooden plug from inside the basal concavity, a Raleigh pattern bullet, 54 caliber, and another Raleigh pattern bullet that is a monster 69 caliber. By the way, those Raleigh pattern bullets were made by the children who lived at the North Carolina School for the Deaf, Dumb, and Blind Children.
Wow.
Now, look at the firing lines. So these firing lines, marked in red, represent the Confederate positions. So where there were dropped Confederate mini balls and incoming or fired Union 54 caliber rounds, we know for a fact then that, and no, by the way, Washington D.C. is not burning down, so don't panic here. We're just in the center of the city, and being in any kind of large urban city in the east, this is what you get. So you see at the bottom of the orchard the position of two Confederate battle lines, because look at all those fired Union rounds. Those Union soldiers aren't firing at specters or imaginary soldiers. They're firing at real targets. And then you'll also see there are some dropped Confederate rounds there. And then as you get farther toward the north or the upper end of the slide and the orchard, you'll see there were two Confederate fire lines. And we know because, thank heavens, Major Hyde, who was called upon by Colonel Irwin to lead this forlorn hope, survived and wrote an incredible account. He had an amazing memory and was a very articulate person. And he talked about how the Confederates drove them into the northwest corner of the orchard. And you can see that they continued after they had cut their way literally through the picket fence at this end of the orchard, were continuing to fire from the cornfield up to the north that was adjacent to the orchard back in to keep the Confederates who were pursuing them from getting closer. The other interesting thing are those four blue stars. They're the fired pistol bullets. A 44 caliber U.S. Army Colt, you're only going to use that effectively at 15 to at most 25 yards. So this is something that was being fired by one of only 3 remaining line officers who were still alive at this point. So now the 7th Maine has gone from 180 some effective on duty to make the attack to less than half, and this in less than 30 minutes. And then they exited in that corner. So this is the beauty and the power of not only being able to have a total station, but being able to have all that GIS and the software packages that can be used in GIS, including kernel density analysis and other things to aid us in interpreting and reconstructing battlefield tactics of the American Civil War. And here you see it. So there is the probable, here it is using Google Earth. You can see the buildings that represent the Piper Farm, the Piper Lane, where the various Confederate units were. And then to refresh your memory, the red circles represent the dropped or unfired Confederate mini balls. The blue triangles represent the fired 54 caliber mini balls of the 7th Maine. And the yellow lines represent possible Confederate skirmish lines and their movements as they drove the 7th Maine out of the orchard and back to Union lines. Maryland Heights. It's that great big blob of Weaverton Quartzsite opposite the historic lower town of Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. It also is known as the Citadel of Harpers Ferry because that was the key for General Jonathan Jackson's old Stonewall to surround and ultimately capture Harpers Ferry as part of the Antietam campaign. It was the largest surrender in all of U.S. military history of United States soldiers. Over 12,000 Union soldiers surrendered as a result of Jackson's investment and bombardment of Harpers Ferry. It is because Harper's Ferry sits in a bowl down at the confluence of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers, and here you see the Potomac in this slide with the various railroad bridges that cross over it into Maryland. And Jackson, after just several days, the Union forces realized they were in a hopeless position because the Confederates were able to put artillery not only up on Maryland Heights, but on Loudon Heights and Cavalier Heights. So there were 3 heights in Virginia, then Virginia, now West Virginia, and Maryland, from which the Confederate artillery could just pour their death and destruction down on the hopeless Union troops, which is why they had to surrender. So, after that, the Union said, never again. We're going to fortify this place to the max. And that's what they did. So here in the lower right, you see a map showing something that looks like it came out of 17th century Ireland. You'll notice there is a fort with opposing bastions. Well, that's what you're looking at the east elevation of, which would be the elevation on the right of that rectangle with the opposing bastions off of it. It's amazing. Who would have constructed a stone fort in 1862 in the Civil War? Well, these guys did. Of course, what they were going to do is then have a wooden superstructure above it, and this was going to be the foundation of the walls. The campgrounds are not modern campgrounds, folks. Those are Civil War campgrounds. Maryland Heights is covered in them, and you always know when you come into a campground because the area has been completely cleared, policed up by all the privates who were camping there. So they took up all the stones, and in some cases they would make these funny little snaky stone walls. In other cases they would make piles of stones so that they could pitch their tents and create their company streets and all that good stuff. This is the only known image of a Union campground on Maryland Heights, and this was, they were going into winter quarters, which is why they constructed them out of logs, and they probably got the boards for the roofs, stealing them off of farm structures from local farms nearby. This is Dr. Susan Trail. She was not a doctor, and she was not a trail at the time this picture was taken. She was an archaeologist with a master's from the College of William and Mary in historical archaeology, and she was the person who was overseeing the archaeological survey of Maryland Heights at the time. If you look at the map in the lower right, Susan is standing in the upper left interior corner. That beautiful map was made by John Ravenhorst, a wonderful person and a fine cartographer and archaeologist, and unfortunately he left us, departed this life way too young with an incurable disease. John's handiwork can also be seen in the slide in the lower right. 1-foot contour interval. That's the only way you can effectively map these earthen fortifications. And so the photograph shows Dennis Fry on the left, Susan Trail on the right, and you can see the platform is in the interior of the earthen embankment, almost dead center of the slide, and you see on the left, inside the earthen embankment, the platform, someone had constructed an illegal campfire here, and Dennis is removing evidence of some of the deadfall that had been gathered up to create the illegal campfire. If you're looking in there, you can also see the embrasures where the artillery tubes poked through the earthen embankment and toward the top or the north of the slide. This is pretty amazing. So we've seen all sorts of rock art, and here you have rock art graffiti. This is Private Parker of Company K, the 13th Massachusetts, 1861. And when I show you the next slide, you will understand why he chose to create this where he did. It's amazing. You are looking up the Potomac River. Harper's Ferry in Lower Town is to the left. And what a prospect. Absolutely drop-dead gorgeous. The house where Lincoln died, also known as the Peterson House, is part of the National Mall of Memorial Parks. It's directly across from Ford's Theater, where President Abraham Lincoln was mortally wounded, and after he was shot, he was taken across the street to the Peterson House. Mr. Peterson was a German immigrant tailor who had come over in the early 1840s. He had a huge family. They also took in boarders. How they got all those people, around 20-some, in this small little row house is beyond me, particularly given what it would have been like living in there with all those people during the months of July and August. And anyone who's ever been in Washington, D.C. in July and August knows it can be pretty darn miserable. So they discovered that the Park Service hadn't exactly done right by the floor they put in sometime in the early 1950s in the room directly beneath the room that Lincoln was taken to and in which he died. They had started to put in a new floor, and they were going to create a crawl or air space beneath it. But they found out that it was chock full of stuff. Artifacts, animal bone. I think it was the animal bone that actually scared them off. So what they did is they put down, bizarrely, a 2 to 3 tenths of a foot layer of asphalt and set the floor joist in the hot asphalt. So the whole floor was floating. The floor joists were not in pockets. Bizarre. So needless to say, this floor did not last very long before it started to deteriorate. So the people who managed the property by this point had no idea that that had been the way that floor was put in back in the early 1950s. So they come in to remove the asphalt, and they bring in people from one of our maintenance facilities at Brentwood, and they start turning over it's not really dirt. It was more artifacts and animal bone and ash than it was anything else. And at that point, they said, we're not digging anymore. We don't like bones. We don't know if they're animal bones, they're human bones. We're out of here. Call us when all this is done, and we'll gladly put your floor in. So I got a phone call from the site manager at that time, and we wound up doing this excavation. But he was a shrewd, natural-born interpreter. His name was Joe Gary. He had probably kissed the Blarney Stone once too often, but that was fine. That's what made him such a great interpreter. And he said, can you guys come back at the end of January so that you're here in early February? And we knew instantly what he wanted. Because Abraham Lincoln's birthday is, ta-da, in early February. And he wanted us to be there because he knew that the national press would be looking for new Lincoln copy around the time of his birthday. So sure enough, AP, UPI, Scripps Howard, you name it, they were all there. This place, which hardly got a visitor in the dead of winter, broke all visiting records for this time of the year because the door that you see that's turned into the room is a Dutch door. So we were able to open the top and close the bottom. And so when the visitors came down from their tour inside the house, they came down a staircase on the rear elevation of the house, which was covered, and they came up to this corner where they had to turn right to go in a hall that took them back out to the front elevation and the main street. So they were able to look in at the excavations. There was also a little recessed area at the end of that hall, and we were able to make a temporary exhibit and put it up and had it on display so they could see some of the actual artifacts that we recovered when we did our initial test, when we realized we had a pretty significant deposit on our hands. What's really neat is, as I mentioned earlier, the historians and the architects had no idea that there had been a fire. So this was the second L edition. The first L edition burned sometime before, obviously, Lincoln was shot and brought over to the house in April of 1865. Most likely, based on the archaeology, the fire occurred probably in 1863. And after the L was destroyed, the Petersons, with this huge family and all these boarders living in this structure, used the area between the original foundation walls of the first L addition as their trash receptacle. After all, there was no Tuesday, Thursday trash collection, so it literally went out the back door. Broken artifacts, animal bones, ash from the fire, ash from the various heating devices they had in the house, and we were able to find 2 builders' trenches. And it's because of the ash layers that we could determine which was which. So in the upper left slide, you see the first builder's trench, and then beneath the ash lens in the lower slide, you will see the much wider original builder's trench for the first L addition, and then the ash lens that covered it. This is really cool. So we get down here, so there's the very narrow second builder's trench dug into the first one, and you can tell the difference between the brickwork. Look at that beautiful brickwork below that thick layer of gloppy mortar, which was put in, and then they instantly started backfilling. And then look at that horrible job of brickwork above the thick layer of mortar. Difference between daylight and dark. Of course, human nature being what it is, some things just don't change. And that 3-piece mold-blown porter bottle was found in the first builder's trench, so masons haven't changed, and they still apparently drink on the job, and which may have had something to do with the quality of their work, although the earlier brickwork is really, really nice. We also found what the cause of the fire in the first L addition was. You can see the remnants of the in situ herringbone brick floor. It's a classic sign of a kitchen. And so there was a kitchen on the first floor of the L addition, and that was apparently the source of the fire that took it out. Beneath that, in the unit just above where you see the in situ herringbone floor pattern, is a swept dirt yard. And they were quite common all the way up into the middle of the 20th century. My mother lived at a home outside of Manassas, Virginia in the 1930s, and it had a swept dirt yard. Catoctin Mountain Park, back to the national park surrounding the presidential retreat of Camp David in western Maryland, and here, roads everywhere. And so you can see how the roads can be discriminated because they're putting the rocks, which is basically all Catoctin Mountain is one giant blob of rhyolite. And you can see the path of the road through the woods. And we found hundreds and hundreds of collier, the evidence of charcoal hearths made by colliers. And here's a period photograph of colliers and the kind of interesting little huts they made for themselves when they were tending the charcoal hearths. And there literally are hundreds of these things on Catoctin Mountain. Also, evidence of farmsteads. In this case, you don't even have to dig. Here's one of the outbuildings to a farmstead. And the types of artifacts that come from them. Some of the earliest of the farmsteads start at the end of the 18th century, but most date from the first and second quarters of the 19th century. Moving up to 1870s, at Manassas National Battlefield Park, that massive stone exterior chimney base was to a small, roughly 16 by 16 foot structure that the Nash family lived in, and they were African Americans. So we're talking about free African Americans in post-Civil War Virginia. The reason we have this knowledge is because one of the Union generals who fought at the Second Battle of Manassas, August 29th and 30th, 1862, had charges brought up against him. And so there was a court-martial, and luckily he was exonerated. But as part of that, they had Union engineers go out and make an incredibly detailed map of Manassas battlefield. And they noted all the homes on it and the last names of the people who lived in it. And if two people had the same last name, they would give you the initial for their first name. Well, just to the right of that exterior chimney footing, we found a small cache. And you can see quartz crystals. You see a Halifax point, roughly about 5,000 years old, of quartz. And then to the left of the Halifax projectile point is a huge lump of galena. And these represent someone's shaman, I would say, curing bag or curing pouch, because all of these things were things that would have been used in African-derived curing rituals. Indeed, some African peoples, like peoples elsewhere in the world, believe that the stone arrowheads derive from the impact of a lightning bolt hitting the ground. And so where a lightning bolt hits the ground, that's where you find a stone projectile point. Always thought that very interesting. Well, now we're getting up even more recent in time. So, upper left corner, that is that building in the far distance in the upper left corner of that slide is the building of the Organization of American Historians. Between the back of that wooden construction fence and the building of the Organization of American Historians is Constitution Avenue. You look just to the right in the center of the slide, that is the Washington Canal Lockkeeper's House, which has been moved several times. So we are now in the area not far from the reflecting pool of the Lincoln. You're not all that far, just a couple of blocks from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial and then, of course, the Lincoln Memorial. And here you see the mother of all late 19th century sewers. The keystone, it has a date on it of 1880. When they excavated this all the way down to the bottom, 2 medium-sized cars could pass through this tunnel. It's incredible. And the number of bricks were just outrageous. And of course, guess what? This added to the construction costs because until we archaeologists found this, no one was expecting they were going to have to remove this sucker to do what they needed to do. Surprise, welcome to the world of urban archaeology. Speaking of which, we end with the Lincoln Memorial, part of National Mall and Memorial Parks. I hadn't hardly gotten my seat warm and had just hired Bob Sonderman. So in the lower right-hand corner, that's a younger me, and Bob Sonderman to my left, so I'm the one with the white hat on, underneath the Lincoln. And I get a phone call. At first I thought it was a joke. He said, "We want you to do an archaeological survey underneath the Lincoln." And I said, "Pardon me, did I hear you right?" The reason was this. They did tours under the Lincoln. So interpreters during the summer months would take those people in the know, usually people on the Hill, the House and the Senate, and if they wanted their family members, their friends who were visiting Washington to have a unique experience, you would go see stalactites and stalagmites that formed under the staircase of marble leading you to Lincoln at the top of the stairs and inside the memorial. So all that marble with National Airport, then called National, now Reagan National, just downriver, and the planes either take off or land almost right over top the Lincoln, which means all their exhaust, it gathers there, and whenever it rains, the water droplets pick that up, and they deposit the acid rain, and it percolates through the cracks in the construction of the marble that makes up the Lincoln. Hence, the staircase is sort of a cave with stalactites and stalagmites. So in the tradition of Monty Python, and now for something completely different, when the rest of Washington, D.C. is burning at around 95 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit in July and August, you'd of course want to go see the stalactites and stalagmites underneath the Lincoln, where it's very nice and cave-like cool. Well, some of the interpreters noticed at the end of their tours, or the beginning of a new one, that certain objects that they had pointed out to the visitors were walking off. through some process of morphogenesis, sprouting legs and walking off, or as others say, the visitors were taking five-finger discounts. So that's why they wanted an archaeological survey. So we had to create a base map for the Lincoln Memorial. And until Bob Sonderman undertook that, it had never been done because there were 5 different construction drawings all showing different architectural features that he had to pull from to give us a base map before we even went under there to document where in the heck this stuff was. Well, then, this was okay. I was kind of going, yawn, until we found these. I am an amateur graphologist. I used to do cartoons for my high school newspaper. And here you have President Wilson with the cigarette holder and the silk top hat, and then a workman behind him. And notice the cotton cloth cap he's wearing. Well, we found one. There it is, hanging on a nail that had been driven into the concrete forms or the foundation of the Lincoln. So the one that took my fancy, though, was the caricature of the construction foreman on the left. He is shown in 5 different locations. This is the most incredible rendering. He's always shown with a slouch hat, a pipe in his mouth, a huge belly, and a rather prominent posterior, which in this case has a little birdie sitting on it, probably to emphasize this person's listlessness. And we believe that this and the one of President Wilson and the workman behind him were executed by Bosco Johnny, whose signature is shown on the right, and given the graphology and the great flourish that he signed his name, I'm willing to bet 99 44 100% that he was the creator of the best of the graffiti under the Lincoln. And hopefully they're redoing the visitor center for the Lincoln Memorial now, and hopefully some of this is going to be featured there. Really interesting. So you never know what you're going to find in the National Capital Region. We have a great website, which I and my colleagues, Tom Gwaltney, Karen Lawrence, and Marion Krevling all had a hand in producing. And please visit it. Also, we have ways electronically that you can ask for both electronic and hard copies of our Regional Archaeology Program series, technical reports, and so they're still available. So please visit the website soon. I don't know how much longer it's going to be up because this is part of that content management system stuff, and so I'm not certain how much longer it will still be available. But I checked it this morning, and it's still alive and well. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, we have about 15 minutes left. So I'm going to be not selfish and open up the phone lines for questions if we have any questions for Stephen. And if not, I'd like to ask him a question or two about his career.
Anybody still out there?
Yeah.
Don't forget to turn on the mic on your phone. Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, well, I'm going to launch into a question since Stephen is here as part of both our Cotter Award winner Research in the Parks and also as part of our Centennial Veteran Archaeologist in the Park Service interview. So, Stephen, so I want to just ask you about when you first decided to become an archaeologist, and then a bit about how you started your job as a Park Service archaeologist.
Sure. My interest in the past began at the tender age of 6. I had a wonderful grandmother, my mom's mom, who was a great storyteller. So when I was 4, 5, and 6, she would relate stories that had been told to her by her grandfather. And that particular individual had been in Lee's Army of Northern Virginia during the American Civil War. The stories she told were amusing anecdotes, so there was nothing about the horrors of the war. And then when I was 6, I was walking with her husband, my granddaddy, in the family barnyard, and there had been a heavy rain the night before, and we were walking along the granary. And the granary didn't have any guttering, but it had 2-foot roof overhangs. So there was quite a drip line on the ground immediately beneath it. My grandfather was a big man. He was 6'2" and large frame. And I maybe came up to his kneecaps at that point. I was 6. And so he's walking along, and I see him kick up something with the toe of his left riding boot. And he says, "Reach down and pick that up, boy." And so I did. And said, "What is it, Granddaddy?" Because I picked this thing up, and it was a gray blob to me, rather heavy for its size. I didn't know what it was. "Well, that's a board from the war, boy." And there was only one war, W-A-H, if you were going to use a Virginia accent, and that was the American Civil War. It was what I now know to be a 3-ring .58 caliber mini ball. And so I said, "Is that the same war that grandmother tells me about, that grandpa told her story?"
Even
Yeah.
He's the regional archeologist.
Oh. So the light bulb went on.
It was. I had it on the.
Between the stories that my grandmother had told me and the fact that I could actually pick up an object from that time.
But he was.
Guys,
I saw him at.
Could you mute your phone for just the last 5 minutes if you're going to talk?
Meeting, but, before the
All right. Let's ask one. I'll have one more question, and then we'll wrap things up.
Sure.
Did you finish?
So anyway, I made the connection between the stories that my grandmother had told me and the fact that I could actually find objects from that time. So it made the past come alive, not only because these were my ancestors, but also because the tangible expression of those times could be found at that date. So I was hooked. It was just a question of whether I wanted to go into history or wanted to go in archaeology.
He was talking about, and I heard this from someone else.
A minor in American history with a specialty in the colonial and Civil War periods. I also have a minor in geology and a minor in statistics.
So how did you choose archaeology, and then how did you choose the Park Service?
Well, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and so I was able to, after discovering that I not only could find Civil War artifacts on my grandparents' farm, but I found out that the cornfields in the far back were loaded with prehistoric Indian artifacts. And at a point, I wanted to know more about them. And so my mother learned that you could call a number at the Natural History Museum and get connected to the appropriate department and specialist to bring your objects in for identification. So she did. They never got rid of it. And so I wound up working as a paid summer intern beginning between my sophomore and junior year of high school, junior year and senior year of high school, and then senior year of high school and freshman year of college. So 3 consecutive summers, I had the incredible experience of being a high school intern working in the Department of Anthropology at Smithsonian Institution. I not only handled archaeological material from Central and South America, from all over North America, but ethnographic material as well. And so I was doing everything from the Pacific to Plains Indians to Northwest Coast, you name it. And it was amazing. And my mentors at the Smithsonian, a couple of Dr. Clifford Evans and Dr. Betty Meggers. And so they gave me reading books, if you will. And actually, for my birthday, they would wind up giving me introductory books on archaeology. So by the time I got to the University of Missouri, I knew as a graduate
on the weekends they changed it to one way.
Specialized in archaeology. And in my introductory archaeology class, I'd already read all the books, and I'll never forget it. It was the only test in my entire career that I actually made 105 on, because in writing the essays, I included parenthetical footnotes, and it blew the professor away so much that I knew the literature so well that I couldn't give him the page number, but I gave him the source for where I got that information. So he was, he really looked askance at me on that one. And he said, how do you know this? So I told him about my background. I also was the same professor that he was up there and he misspelled Betty Meggers' last name.
Wait, why would people be going?
And he put in Hamless. And I raised my hand and I'm sorry, Professor so-and-so, but her last name is spelled. And sure enough, he went home that night and looked it up and came in and said, you're right. And I said, yes, I know. I only have known her since I was 11 years old. So I was blessed.
And unfortunately,
Should we wrap up?
Sure.
Thank you so much. Thanks, folks out there. We're going to wrap up this session. Next week, we're going to have William Ricey talking about his Cotter Award-winning project. It's a survey project of Petrified Forest National Park. It's been conducting the research for about 4 years. So I'll be sending out emails for the subsequent presentations that are going to run throughout the fall. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining us, and we'll talk to you next week. And thank you, Stephen Potter, very much for joining us.
I don't know how
there's
that would
lots
help.
of other options
How that would help
that
anything.
archeologists come up with. So, I think that coupled with flaggers, flaggers are part of the plan. Intersection control with flaggers, and as a stoplight.
Right.
But real time where you can do that. Kind of, from my perspective.
Ruth Ann Canute.